Well, thank you all so much for having me here today. My name is Hazel. I am now a public librarian. Public libraries. The modern public library is a lot of different things. And I want to do a little thought exercise with you all here. So you can close your eyes if you want to. I want to imagine yourself in a public space that you know pretty well and that you've been to a lot of times and that you've seen some things in. A grocery store is a really good example. You can imagine the public library if you want. Um, but I would encourage you to think about like a grocery store or that public park or even a gas station, some place where you see a lot of different humans. And I'd like you to think about what you see as you think about every trip you've been there. And then what you've seen, how you've seen people treat others when they're waiting in line, how you've seen, maybe a teenager translating for their family. Maybe you've seen some teenagers, running down the aisles and having fun. Maybe you've seen some kids goofing off. Maybe you've seen a few biohazards around, Maybe you've seen some really great examples of fantastic humans doing fantastic things and interacting with others well. Or maybe you've seen some examples of humans having a really bad day. And maybe that bad day is really justified because like the system's against them. The systems are against them. And maybe you've seen like an amazing amount of, the equivalent of someone slipping on a banana peel and then this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. Then I want you to think about that and say, imagine if you worked in that environment every single day. That is your public library. So whether big or small, it is full of wonderful, wonderful things. It is full of delight. We have to be a place that is open and free to all, and we pride ourselves on that. And this is really important because it's one of the few, unlike some of those places I mentioned, where whether it be a gas station or a grocery store, where there's all different ages of people, where there's all different backgrounds, there's all different languages, there's all different like ways of interacting with the world. We've got neurodiversity, we've got diversity of all types, which is a wonderful thing. But as you can imagine, we're not all perfect all the time, right? Perfection, So, whoops. And that's okay, right? But your public library is one of the few spaces where we actually encourage people to come in, to be there, to interact with others, and to stay there without purchasing a thing. Okay? So that's a very different space than at least when I operated our tool library with our tool library team. And maybe, despite everything, despite all the similarities we have. I think a few things I want to call out is not a lot of places have public bathrooms anymore. We do. It's not a place where you have to spend money, right? It's not a place where you can have like large collaborative parties. You can have work parties, you can have meetings, but you also need to have areas for silence. And please, other folks who know libraries well, you're welcome to like chat along on the thing, say, yes, no, Hazel's wrong, like totally call me out on it. But overall, I just want to make sure that we all understand that the modern library is a community hub. And we're actually working actively towards that. We don't just lend books. Most libraries you go to, it's a space where you're, meeting, whether it's for story time or you're lending online services. Sometimes you're lending craft classes. Sometimes you're lending DVDs. So a lot of folks, even if you don't officially have a library of things, which is, I would say, one of the more common brands. Sometimes it has unusual things to borrow. We call these things different. You still might, you're like, well, we don't have a library of things, but, we lend a telescope, right? So sometimes there's that level of knowledge to it. And the way the library cards work is a little different. I want to call that out. So if you, for example, in my town, if you have to pay taxes to have a library card with our library, or you have to purchase that library card. Or the entity that you're with, like say the community center for people experiencing homelessness, they have cards for folks experiencing homelessness and things like that. So there's kind of ways around it. But in other systems, the library card setup works differently. But everyone, regardless of if you have a card or not, can use public computers, can get access to our programs. So again, our programs have to be free and open to all. And we're coming back to that later because that's important, is an important difference that I had to get used to. This is really great because this means that as a collaborator for your stuff, they can bring so many good things. They can bring great humans, unique access to different types of groups. They can have decades worth of how to run programs, lending expertise. Oh man, talk to them about if you have a stinky tool, they know all the ways to get rid of that. We've got dogs that search out bed bugs, there's all sorts of things. So they've got an amazing amount of wisdom. Biohazards. They really know their biohazards. Not to mention all the other things. You can offer space with amazing publicity resources, easy registration. There's clients who work just with public library systems. You've got space and how that space can be recreated to meet the needs of different groups, how we can go out to community members with different types of vehicles or lack thereof and meet people where they're at. Amazing community relationships with communities. People love, donating or speaking for public libraries, coming to speak and donating their time and resources. Again, a lot of experience with multilingualism, different cooperation examples. And there are libraries that are lending humans, right? Stories, lending different types. There's something called the human library. There are libraries that are lending recipes. There are libraries that are lending stories. And of course, there are libraries that are lending things, not to mention space, land, all the stuff. So they can be a really great collaborator. I also think it's really important to call out that the ALA, the American Library Association, has a bunch of core values. They actually just redid them like yesterday. So they have now only 5. But you can see this is where it came from. Sustainability will still be on there. There's a few that are still on there. The public good is still on there. They're trying to simplify them. So this is out of date. But you can see that some of these, you could see, oh, well, these are in line with our tool library values. And I'm going to be quite frank. Some of them are going to cause you trouble working with libraries. Because the fact, for example, we can't share our members with you, right? We have to also respect their confidentiality. We do not track what our members take out. We happen to know who the last person was who checked out the item, but beyond that, we don't know. So sometimes this can cause an issue, and there's very, very good reasons for this. Again, I want to go back to a couple of things that I think are really important to call out for working with public libraries. First off, and a lot of, including the tool library I was a part of, we charged we had a sliding scale. So you didn't have to pay money to be part of the tool library, but we encouraged you to if you were able to. And so we did have membership fees. In this case, if you take a class, there has to be no costs. We have to pay for everything as a public library. And different libraries get their funding in different ways. Some have an annual campaign that pays for programming. Others, their annual campaign pays for books. Others, their annual campaign pays for their staff salaries. In our library, the salaries are paid by the municipal government, but we're not municipal employees. And the building is owned by the municipal government. But all the book funds come from an annual fund. That is not true a couple towns over. And if you go to different libraries around the different states, different countries, it's going to be different each place. So sometimes the regional something has control over some things, and then other times it's the town. Other times it's neither. And it's just a nonprofit. The other thing, again, we have to be open for the public. And you're probably thinking, well, of course, that makes sense. Aha, here's some trickiness. So for example, if we want to have a group, we had the Mid-Coast Indigenous Awareness Group that we partnered with here at the public library to put on a number of book groups with, which is great. So if you were interested in learning more about the original inhabitants of this land and those folks who are still here, you could join us and learn and this great book group and learn all about a lot of different issues that you might be interested in, and had great speakers and everything. Later on, we wanted to sponsor a LGBTQ plus QIA plus. Yes, I think that's what it was at the time, book group. But we actually had to not sponsor it because once we worked with the community to create that book group, they wanted to make sure that they didn't have to do a lot of code switching. They wanted to make it so that it was only open to people who identified as such as within that book group. So they needed to keep the membership closed off to certain members of the public. So they didn't have to code switch and things, which was fine, but again, not appropriate for the public library. So you could see that maybe, we couldn't do just, certain groups of certain types, which I know in some great places in our community, they are able to do that. We also have to have things that are suitable to the space. So your public library might have different spaces, and sometimes those spaces have carpeting, or sometimes those spaces they've had to say no to certain things because They have to be free and open to all, but they also have a building policy. It may be by sometimes opening up to certain activities, they actually open themselves up to other activities. And it's not maybe your activity that's the problem, but maybe it's, for example, if there's a no food policy, it might not be you that are the problem, but it might be the fact that there are folks with severe allergies, or it might be the fact that every carpet has gotten ruined ever because they allowed birthday parties in there. And so things got squished into the floor. I don't know. I'm not making assumptions on that. I'm just saying I've worked here over the past 7 years. It's been some really interesting things being like, oh, that's why that's not going to work, you know, versus it really will work wonderfully in a different space. So I would encourage you, whenever you run into these things at a library, try to dig in more to say why and be like, oh, so that way we could work around it when you work together. And then we have some quirky things that you may not know. Like, I didn't realize that when you give gifts to certain public servants, they have to be under $10 US, otherwise they could count as a bribe. So so like there's some things like that that sometimes development officers at a public library are aware of, because we work so often with these with saying thank you to so many different groups, that there's some quirky situations like that. In some, there's some things, more stuff you will encounter here. Staff silos. If you get no from one person, don't necessarily take that as the end all be all. There are sometimes like maybe the children's department would really like to work with you, or the community engagement folks would really like to work with you, even though, you know, the adult programming folks are like, not going to work for us. Sometimes in these organizations, there really are those staff silos. So don't forget to ask, oh, actually, do you think I could get in contact with them just to see if we could get in on this angle? We made that mistake when we started the main tool library. We only asked a couple people. We should have asked more. Another thing I've learned is that there's a lot of different structures. So I already talked about that before, but I would just really encourage you to ask those questions about that, because that could give you ways in and ways to collaborate you might not know about. A colleague of mine, she actually didn't start a tool library in her library, but they started a tool library that they called the Electric Tool Library out of the municipal building works department. And the reason they were able to do it is because their municipal department was actually very concerned about being sued, because guess what? Government departments have been sued before. So if you're working with a government department that's been sued before, they might be a little more concerned about lending some of these items than, you know, a nonprofit who hasn't had that concern. But in this case, they were able to work around all of those concerns by working out of the Public Works Department, which had the right type of insurance. And then the public library managed all the lending, but they didn't manage the actual municipal building. So that was a cool kind of collab. And again, follow up with me. I can get you contacts to these humans. There's also the classic concerns you're probably going to run into. So funding, storage, the concept of, well, what if we don't know about tools and these people do? You know, how's that going to work? And also, how does that play into it? I know at some libraries there's big concerns about, okay, well, how does the hierarchy work then? If you have a person who knows about tools but doesn't have a library degree, and you have a person with a library degree, how is the training going to work? How are you going to get around that? And all of these are, anyway, you can overcome these, but it's just something to know about. The biggest concern that surprised me was aesthetics. And I'm going to get more into that when I show you pictures and examples, but I'm going to definitely come back to that. That floored me. I also want to call out, if you don't know what's going on in the US with public libraries, I would highly recommend you take a look at what's happening in your area. And that's just around the world, not just the US. But there are places where if they lend the wrong book, actually a librarian could suffer 5 years of jail now. So there are just a lot of pressing issues. Hunger, poverty, all sorts of things that librarians are dealing with on a daily basis. So again, if you get an initial no, try to figure out why. Because if you can help them meet their goals, that could be really powerful for all of you, you know? And I guarantee they want to meet those goals with you. The other thing, again, at public libraries, you're going to encounter some pretty expert teams. I mean, the catalogers here, wow. There's some crazy knowledge there, and they're not using tons of it with library of things items, but it's really fascinating to see stuff from their perspective and how, well, what if we globalize this and how will that work? You're also going to encounter a ton of enthusiasm and excitement. There's so many folks who want to work with you, and tool libraries and toy libraries and all the libraries you can think of. So I've already gone over this, but I'm just going to say in sum, be ready for this and keep trying. So our differences are going to make us stronger overall, right? Once we figure out how to communicate, and try to, I would say, focus on the win-wins. And I'm going to go into how to actually, I would suggest some strategies that have worked out well for some other tool librarians and librarians I know who have crossed this threshold to be like, okay, let's cooperate and do this. So this is the one I wanted to go back to. The one thing I think is really important for you to understand that I didn't realize to the level, and it took me years to understand this one, is aesthetics. Be aware that if you do work with a public library, there are some of those sticking points I mentioned, but one big one is aesthetics. And this won't be at every public library, but just as an example, I've shown many public librarians what a tool library can look like, really well organized. And I've seen some people start hyperventilating because they're imagining a dirty tool on their shelves, right? They're imagining the worst case scenario because these are folks who have seen a lot over the years. So I think sometimes it really helps. I have tons of presentations on what we finally decided were systems that worked for us. What you see to the left here is like in our basement, everything is labeled in English. We're working on, I'm going to steal some ideas from all of you, some great signage and stuff. Everything has its place. Everything has an item. Everything is checked outable like a book. Again, we have amazing staff who has helped us come up with this. I can't tell you check-in after check-in after check-in of all the clever humans who have better ideas on how to make this happen than me. I had to learn to laminate and use zip ties and use plastic boxes, things I never thought I would do because I'm kind of an eco freak. So worth it in this case to make it work. We learned how to hang things differently. There's special hangers you can buy and there's special bars you can get. So we have presentations that we've given to other libraries trying to start libraries of things in order to make this palatable for their work environment. And there's some really good reasons for that. Some libraries are in unions and there's safety and other libraries aren't. And other libraries have other concerns because they're working more with an aged population. So they need it, or not even aged. They just know that they're not going to be able to read small labels and small print. So there's just so much to learn to work around here. So, but again, this is what a standard library of things may look like. Again, the larger items there that you see are hanging in the basement away from the public eye, not because we wouldn't share them, but also because there's kids running around. We do lend most of these items to kids. There's only a few that we don't, but it's also nice not to have the like mini pianos right where everyone can play them all the time, because we did that and then we changed it up because there were complaints. Again, there's also some minutia, like if you haven't found silicone bands, if you haven't found clear things that people can use their barcode scanners on, these are all the types of things that we had to work on and learn from. So I'm not going to talk about this ad nauseum in this presentation. I just want you to be aware that these are absolutely sticking points, and that you shouldn't be afraid of them. Be like, we can figure it out together, because you can.